From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David. How are you doing today?
I'm very excited.
And we also have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello.
We have another jam-packed show today. Up first on the program, we have two guests, Dr. Rania Milleron, who is a microbiologist and a public health advocate, and Dr. Nicholas Sakellariou, who is a professor who lectures on engineering ethics. They have combined to produce a book entitled Ethics, Politics, and Whistleblowing in Engineering. And I'm going to tell you why that's so important in a minute, which is just the first half of the show, by the way. In the second half of the show, we're going to welcome back Karen Friedman of the Pension Rights Center. The Pension Rights Center is a nonprofit consumer organization committed to protecting and promoting the retirement security of American workers, retirees, and their families. And just this week, a government report came out with dire predictions about the solvency of Social Security. And I hope Ms. Friedman will fill us in on what all that really means. And she'll also give us an update on something we talked about when she last visited, the corporate attempt to cut benefits for defined benefit pension plans. These are real pocketbook election issues that I would imagine would be important for the Democrats to bring up as they try to attract older voters. And as always, we will also take some time out to check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. And if we have time at the end, we'll try to squeeze in some listener questions. But first, I want to set the table here for our discussion about ethics in engineering. Why is this important? As most of our listeners know, Ralph came to prominence in the mid-'60s with his book, Unsafe at Any Speed, which revolutionized how the country and the world dealt with auto safety. That whole campaign was, in essence, an example of ethics in engineering. Auto engineers for years knew about design flaws that made cars unsafe. And they knew about features that could have been applied to make those cars safer, like seat belts, airbags, padded dashboards, and hey, maybe we don't design the steering wheel with a sharp point in the middle that can stab you in a crash. Stuff like that. But because executives were worried that safety didn't sell, and in general didn't want to be regulated, these design flaws and safety features were kept under wraps, buried. As a result, tens of thousands of people died every year on our streets and highways, deaths that could have been prevented. Ralph not only went into the archives and found that these safety features existed, but he also talked to engineers in Detroit. These whistleblowers would meet with him in unmarked cars, and as they either circled the airport or circled the plant, tell him what was really going on. Soon after Unsafe at Any Speed was published, legislation was passed that mandated that seat belts and other features become standard equipment. Tens of thousands of lives were saved and continue to be saved because whistleblowers in engineering came forward. In short, this was a public health crisis that had an engineering fix, an epidemic that was cured by an engineering vaccine. These ethics and engineering issues have come to the forefront once again upon the two recent crashes, the Boeing MAX 8. It extends to issues involving platforms like Facebook and the information it collected that was used by Cambridge Analytica. And for those of you who remember the Space Shuttle Disaster Challenger, the same thing. And in that not too distant past, the flooding that resulted from Hurricane Katrina. It's important for engineers to not only be able to design and build things, but do so within an ethical framework and to come forward and blow the whistle when they see that that ethical code is being violated. So we're going to dive into all of that with Drs. Milleron and Sakellariou. And we're structuring this program a little differently today. Dave and I will be taking the lead in conducting the interview, with Ralph offering a post-mortem commentary. But first, David is going to introduce our guests.
Dr. Rania Milleron is a microbiologist at the Texas Department of State Health Services in Austin. She's both a biomedical scientist and a public health professional who always brings a multidisciplinary perspective to her work. She is not an engineer, but because of her outsider perspective, she was able to unify in a book voices that champion good works in engineering. That book is entitled Ethics, Politics, and Whistleblowing in Engineering. Also joining us is her co-author, Dr. Nicholas Sakellariou. Dr. Sakellariou is a lecturer at California Polytechnic State University College of Engineering, where he teaches engineering ethics and professional responsibilities classes. In addition to the book we are discussing today, He is also the author of a book about renewable energy systems, which we will also link to on our website. Welcome, both of you, to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Wonderful to be here.
Thank you so very much. It's a great honor. Thank you for having us.
Ronnie, let's start with you. In a nutshell, what is ethics, politics, and whistleblowing about?
Okay, so let's use an example from the healthcare profession where there's an ethic that says, first, do no harm. Well, what we found in the engineering profession, there's more of an ethos that says, let's design it now, and, well, if it doesn't turn out like we thought, we'll just ask for forgiveness later. And so what the book is really about is how to bring that first do no harm ethic into the world of engineering and to teach engineers how to solve problems, or through examples in our book, with an ethical framework. So what happened to me is working on this book put a real fire in my belly about the urgent need for ethical concerns to be incorporated really into the very fiber of engineers. So in a nutshell, that's what I would say the book is about.
Nicholas, what would you add to that?
Absolutely. Two things that I would like to add to Rania's wonderful point. I think the first thing that comes to mind is that engineering codes of ethics are somewhat of a paradox. And the reason behind that is because even though some engineers are indeed members of professional organizations, those codes of ethics do not apply to non-members of organizations. And even if someone is a member, there's no law that binds all engineers, like in the medical profession, to abide by their codes of ethics. Rania mentioned that, yes, engineers have this design it first and ask for forgiveness later sort of ethos, which is very different from the above all, do not harm that medical practitioners have. It's interesting that Google, until very recently, had the clause do not be evil in their company's code of conduct.
Right.
Still, engineers at Google are, according to reports from whistleblowers and former Googlers, working on a pretty ethically controversial project called Project Dragonfly that was basically the Chinese version of Google's search engine. And according to whistleblowers and people, veterans at Google, this project would be putting at risk Chinese citizens at the risk of interrogation or detention if they were actually found to have used Google to seek out information banned by the government. So it seems to me that, yes, this ethic, above all, do not do harm, is very important, but also we have to find ways to both structurally and legally enforce this ethic. Because like I said, the codes of ethics exist, but there's no law that binds engineers to abide by these codes of ethics.
Well, one of the things that I'd like to, that I think is important in this conversation is really what we're talking about is we're talking about strengthening laws, but we're also really fundamentally talking about changing the culture of engineering. And so, certainly while keeping corporate fraud and abuse in check is critical to changing the culture of engineering, it's only one component of a multifactorial solution that will produce change. And so I think we have to think even beyond laws and codes of ethics and think about how we can change the culture by including different perspectives in engineering, by changing engineering education. And these topics, for example, bringing the humanities into engineering, these topics are discussed in our book, Ethics, Politics, and Whistleblowing in Engineering. Ultimately, it's about changing the whole culture of engineering. And that's not going to happen overnight, but it will happen. And the more educated that engineers become about all of these different dimensions, ethical dimensions and other, the more likely we are to produce change.
Well, Nicholas, you teach courses in this ethics and engineering. How do the engineers respond? Because engineers are very, by reputation, very concrete thinking individuals, and philosophical questions may not necessarily be in their bailiwick. How do they respond to your classes?
The response has been amazing. And it seems to me that what's really, really important here is from the very beginning of the class to address this question of relevancy, meaning that the engineer, the technical practitioner, the individual that is schooled to see the world through the lens of math, physics, the laws of nature, they have to realize that what they do really affects the world, the kind of value-laden decisions that they take as engineers while designing platforms, while designing airplanes, while designing infrastructure. And the way I do it is through many, many case studies, and I also bring them statistics. I have stories from venture capitalists. I have whistleblowing, ethical engineering testimonies. I bring guest lectures. So it really has to be something, a constant reminder through case studies, through concrete. You mentioned concrete. So I have to use concrete examples to illustrate that what they do really, really involves taking a stance.
Right.
Because they really take a stance. They design code, they design project, but they actually design society. They design culture.
But doesn't this also
socio-technical systems? Yes.
Yes. Doesn't this also require companies to have systems in place where whistleblowing can take place or where problems can be addressed despite the pressure from the executives to push forward?
And that's part of changing the engineering culture, I believe, to have engineers working in an environment where they are able to blow the whistle. And these engineers who have blown the whistle, I would say they're really saints of the engineering world who have carried out this action. And we can talk about, I think it's really important to bring up who these people, some of these people were and what their names were and what they did, because these are harrowing stories, and it shouldn't be that way. They shouldn't have to be in an environment in the corporate or government or other workplace where you have to, as Ralph Nader says, you have to have courage to express candor.
Right. Well, let's name some names. Tell us some of these stories.
So I wanted to start with some of the whistleblowers that we talk about in our book. And one of the things that I've found in engineering is we know a lot about what engineers design, like civil engineers, the bridges, the buildings, the products that electrical, mechanical engineers design, the airplanes, all of that, but we don't know many of their names. And so that's why I wanted to talk, starting in the early part of the 20th century. Let's talk about Peter Kulchytsky, who Nicholas wrote about in our book. And he was a mining engineer in the early part of the 20th century who spoke out about safety concerns and felt that these concerns were paramount. And he felt that engineering was not simply a technical field and that the humanities had a big place within the technical world to create Russian engineers that are more competitive. He felt they needed to have an understanding about the humanities area, not simply the technical area. So he was outspoken and he was a whistleblower, if you will. They didn't use that term back then for someone like him, but for miner safety. And in 1928, when Stalin took power, Peter Kulchytsky was executed for what he did. And let's talk about then, later on in the 20th century, William Stiglitz, who was an aeronautical engineer. He really championed the need for standards to improve safety in aviation. He was so well thought after that in the 1960s, the National Traffic Safety Agency, he was sought out to write the standards for that agency. And he was the person who was responsible for bringing this idea of crashworthiness to vehicles. Nobody really championed that idea. If you can believe it, it was controversial to talk about developing safe automobiles.
Right.
And so what happened was he wrote these standards that would really move the automobile industry forward. And ultimately, they took him off the project 2 weeks before the standards were going to be published. And he ended up resigning because the new standards had nothing to do with what he had developed over time, well thought out. And he maybe inadvertently was a whistleblower. The press helped a lot in this situation. The New York Times reported on the fact that he resigned, and they brought a lot of attention to this issue and showed that there's got to be something going on in the National Traffic Safety Agency to make this leader resign at this stage. And he stood up for safety for the rest of his career, but paid a lot in terms of economically paid for what he did and what he stood for. There's also so many nuclear engineer whistleblowers. Nuclear engineering is an area where a mistake can impact the entire human race and all biological diversity. So any error is, the scope of an error is huge, right? And so back in the 70s, for example, there were 3 engineers who worked for GE who resigned because they were warning about the fundamental safety problems that industry was not paying attention to, and neither was the Nuclear Regulatory Commission paying attention to these issues that had to do with safety. So they resigned, and then their resignation made another statement about the lack of attention to these fundamental safety issues in their area. And they were one of the few engineers who went about sort of unscathed. They definitely sacrificed, but they went on and created their own consulting agency after that, and they consulted for a movie, The China Syndrome, and they helped the Union for Concerned Scientists. But there were others who were not as lucky. There was Jim Pope, who was a mechanical engineer and went to work for the FAA, and he wanted to keep the FAA true to its mission of making flying as safe as possible. But he was convinced that that was not happening with regard to their collision avoidance system development at the time. And so he did take a lot of personal risk to point out the problems in this area. And there was a lot of retaliation against him. And there were personal effects on his health. And there's another whistleblower who, it's fascinating, the case of the Challenger, and that is Roger Beaujolais.
Yeah.
Really amazing story. If your listeners, it's talked about in our book, Ethics, Politics, and Whistleblowing in Engineering. But if you want to look online at videos of Roger Beaujolais talking about ethics and engineering and others, Roger Beaujolais was a booster rocket engineer who worked for a contractor, a NASA contractor called Morton Thiokol. And he was on the team to develop these O-rings, which were sealing these joints that were part of the rocket booster. And this is a very important component of the success of the project. And he knew that at temperatures of 53 degrees, these O-rings would not fail. They would be successful. But given that the Challenger was to be launched in Florida on an incredibly cold day, 22 degrees, sub-freezing, there was a big question about whether this would fail or not. And it did fail. And, there was loss of 7 astronauts' life. There was $2 billion worth of damage. But the worst part was that there was a cover-up. And they tried to cover up what happened. And what they did to him was they isolated him, and they caused severe health problems. He had post-traumatic stress disorder. He had to leave Morton Thiokol. And so it's really, if you look at what some of these people, the risks that some of these people have taken, because they truly want to make this world better. They truly want people to be able to learn from the mistakes of the past. It's inspirational.
These are great stories, but I don't see a lot of engineers going, yeah, I want to do that. What needs to happen with whistleblowing laws? I know Ralph is instrumental in the first ones to either strengthen them or make engineers aware of them that will make this less of a, I'm going to give up my life for this.
I was hearing Rania's wonderful stories about the whistleblowers that we talked about in the book. And I'm thinking that, and this is something that Rania and I have been talking about over the years, the book that we wrote is honestly tapping into an ongoing ethical engineering momentum that is, I think, sort of unfolding in both the engineering and the non-engineering worlds. And you mentioned in the introduction about Rolf's seminal work with Unsafe at Any Speed. I so happened to read the other day an article about why Silicon Valley's growth at any cost is kind of the new unsafe at any speed. And I've been hearing stories in the corporate engineering world about a huge upsurge in activism within the technology community. We've seen walkouts at Google. We've seen people, labor organizing at Amazon. We're seeing tech workers trying to make the rest of us or their colleagues to see that there's indeed a connection between what they do and social issues. So, for example, another whistleblower that comes to mind with regards to the modern technology, digital technology, his name is Ashkan Soltani. He worked in the Silicon Valley for many years, and he recently gave a testimony before a U.S. Senate subcommittee where he said that no other single company has done more to erode consumer privacy than Facebook. It's the same engineer who speaks about privacy laws as the new unsafe at any, unsafe at any speed.
For the digital world, yes.
Exactly. There was a recent New York Times piece that showed how engineers are actually questioning the why, which goes hand in hand with whistleblowing. Tech workers, the title has it, now want to know, what are we building this for?
I was going to say, Nicholas and Rania, this suggests that the culture is changing, at least for a new generation that's working in Silicon Valley.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I just wanted to interject the whole notion of public interest engineering. So public interest engineering is now something that people are talking about, just, I would say, in the contemporary time. I haven't heard that term used. And it's really bringing together different universities, MIT, Stanford, Berkeley, to offer to students this curriculum in public interest engineering. So definitely an example of how the culture is changing and how minds are opening. And I think that the climate is right for our book, Ethics, Politics, Whistleblowing, and Engineering.
Absolutely. And we will give young engineers more background to solidify and legitimize the fact that they are, these days saying no thanks to recruiters, for example, citing ethical concerns. I had an interesting discussion in my class the other day, and one student brought the example of a female engineer who said publicly on Twitter that she will not be considering a job at Google now or in the future unless the company seriously rethinks the way it does business by putting human rights before profit. So young, budding computer experts particularly can now, for the first time in history of engineering, we can say no thanks because they can afford it. They can say no to Google because another company will hire them anyway. So that is, for me at least, setting a very important ethical background, and it also adds to the ethical engineering momentum that I was talking about earlier.
And I want to say that our book provides a resource to these young engineers who want to say no thank you, because it has all of the major codes of ethics. It has examples of people who came before them, who stood up, and it has ways of navigating the world of whistleblowing. It's a very rare event really for an engineer, but if you needed to blow the whistle, it talks about that. And so I think that that's sort of the place for this book, is to give a backbone to those engineers, to support them who want to stand up and make things better.
Right.
Well,
absolutely.
There you have it. For all you engineers out there, the book is called Ethics, Politics, and Whistleblowing in Engineering. And where can they get the book?
So on Amazon.
All right. I'm not sure Ralph will be happy about that. Is there any other way they can get the book?
Apple Books.
It's sold through CRC Press. They could get it from the press, from a bookstore who will order it for you.
Very good. Very good. And it seems like things are moving in the right direction in your mind?
It seems to me.
In certain regards, but in other regards, we haven't made much progress. For example, women that can add a different perspective to this, moving the whole ethics over profits in the right direction, are not represented in the engineering field. When you have 14% of working engineers as women, I think you're missing a whole perspective. And that's definitely an area that we need to work on. But that's part of changing the culture, not just by encouraging girls to go into STEM fields. We've tried that for decades. What we need to do now is work on changing the culture so that women can be integrated as women into the field of engineering.
Right.
Are we seeing examples of tech companies refusing Pentagon contracts?
Yes. Google had a drone project that they were considering, and Google engineers publicly voiced ethical concerns over that project because they cited ethical concerns.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds like a good sign.
One thing I would like to add to Rania's point about, yes, we are indeed moving to the right direction, but we still have a lot of work to do. I think besides the very important issues of diversity, inclusivity, changing the culture that Rania talks about in the book, we should also think about more solid, transparent laws that will hold corporate powers accountable. I was listening the other day. There's a very interesting talk by the British investigative journalist that revealed the Cambridge Analytica scandal. She makes a very convincing case about how Facebook really affected Brexit. She is tracking the results of Brexit in kind of a series of misleading Facebook ads that targeted vulnerable Brexit-wing voters. And she also links the same players and the same tactics, the same procedures to the 2016 presidential election in the United States. And it's, for me, really, really shocking that Mark Zuckerberg has been called to testify in the European Union, and he's said no repeatedly. So Facebook is literally beyond British law, which doesn't make any sense. And Carol Cadwallader, the journalist, makes a case that, whatever is done on Facebook stays on Facebook, which is a threat to democracy, basically, because we do not really know. We cannot know. Those companies still suggest black boxes that are beyond laws, and we cannot hold them accountable, which is, I think, a terrifying thought.
Yeah.
In San Francisco, they weren't allowing self-driving cars, but Uber went ahead and tested them anyway. Do we have other examples of corporations doing things without permission and asking for forgiveness later?
Right. So Uber and Facebook come to mind. Uber is infamous for having used the tool that they called Grable, that basically relied on data collected from the Uber app that, riders would use, and also other techniques to both identify and eventually circumvent officials who were trying to clamp down on that particular service. And it's blatantly unethical. Another example that comes to mind has to do with the usage of so-called big data, data that users provide to platforms like Facebook. Back in 2014, a lot of Facebook users got really angry when they realized that the engineers would manipulate what the user would see when they logged into the platform as a way to, quote, see or monitor how that would alter their moods. This is the so-called Facebook mood experiment that the engineers at Facebook were able to sort of explain as, quote, research. But the ethical outrage that entailed that, again, so-called experiment indicates that those practices are clearly against what you and I would consider ethical.
Well, I want to thank both of you for joining us today. The book is Ethics, Politics, and Whistleblowing in Engineering. The authors are Drs. Rania Milleron and Nicholas Sakellariou. We will link to that at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us.
So, Ralph, let's bring you into the discussion here. You wrote the foreword for Ethics, Politics, and Whistleblowing in Engineering. What do you think about all of this?
Well, this is a book that affects everybody in the world. I mean, when you have engineers working on a whole range of technologies that affect people's health, safety, and economic well-being, and we don't have to give many examples. You're talking about technologies that pollute. You're talking about chemical plants. You're talking about auto manufacturers. You're talking about nanotechnology. You're talking about military weapon systems. We're about to focus more and more on their whistleblower rights. There's an article very recently in the New York Times called "Used to Work for Google, I Am a Conscientious Objector" by Jack Poulson. And his point is that more and more workers for the tech companies, not being unionized so they can't be protected, speaking out by the union, are banding together and putting it to management and say they don't want to work on software that is used by dictators to oppress their people. They don't want to work on Pentagon weapon systems. And the laws, which are better than they were when there were no whistleblowing laws, they need to be strengthened. Now, you can be a whistleblower in the U.S. government and blow whistle on corporate fraud on the taxpayer, and if the Justice Department joins the suit and settles or wins the case, you can get a share of the money. And that's worked to save tens of billions of dollars from when the law was passed in 1986 by a Republican in the Senate and a Democrat in the House taking the leadership. It's called the False Claims Act. In the water pollution law, you can report, if you're working for a company, you can report violations of water pollution standards and be protected. But there needs to be an overall whistleblower protection statute. So people who are engineers and scientists and others can take their conscience to work. Otherwise, what you're seeing here is the beginning of the end of the very concept of a profession. Because a profession, whether it's doctor, lawyer, architect, engineer, has three characteristics. One is supposed to be independent. Two, has a learned tradition and, research, publication. And three, a duty of public service. That's the difference between a profession and a trade. And why do they have those characteristics? Because they're given privileges. They're given quasi-monopolies. I mean, you can't play architect or play lawyer or play engineer without a license. So that's why this book is so important, Ethics, Politics, and Whistleblowing and Engineering, and that it shows case studies of what people have done and saved lives as a result because they took their conscience to work. They blew the whistle or they quit and reported hazardous conditions or products to the proper authorities. I don't think a lot of engineering students know about this, and they don't study much about this because the curriculum is deemed to be too full and there's not much time. But they're all going to have these qualms of conscience. I mean, how would you like to be an engineer in Boeing and have the management in Boeing said, you move with this 737 MAX, you put those heavy engines on a 737 fuselage, and you say, but boss, this is going to change the center of gravity. It's going to change the aerodynamics. It's going to make the plane prone to stall. People can be killed, as they were in Indonesia and Ethiopia. And the boss says, you want your job? So what's your recourse? Well, your recourse should be whistleblower protection rights if Boeing is not going to allow you to form a union. It's a very important book. Don't think it's just a book for technical people. It's a book for everybody who has a conscience and who believes that morality has to infuse the daily work of engineers.
Well, thank you for that, Ralph. We have been speaking with Doctors Rania, Milleron, and Nicholas Sakellariou. When we come back, we will welcome back Karen Friedman, Policy Director for the Pension Rights Center. She'll talk about the future of Social Security and your pension. Don't go away.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, April 26, 2019. I'm Russell Mokhiber. In 1979, Nature magazine invited Sheldon Krimsky to debate Nobel laureate David Baltimore, then a professor of biology at MIT, on the collaborations between industry and biology. Krimsky argued that academic institutions and academic scientists need to be free from corporate influence. Just as war-related research compromised a generation of scientists, we must anticipate a demise in scientific integrity when corporate funds have an undue influence over scientific research, Krimsky argued. Baltimore said there was nothing wrong with universities serving as a source of technical expertise for newly developing industries or even for mature industries. Fast forward 40 years, Sheldon Krimsky is at Tufts University and he's just authored a book titled Conflicts of Interest in Science, How Corporate-Funded Academic Research Can Threaten Public Health. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. This week, a scary government report came out that stated that the cost of Social Security will exceed its income in 2020. I looked at my calendar, and according to my calculations, turns out that's next year. The program's reserve fund is expected to be depleted in 16 years, which means smaller payments to retirees. To tell us what's up with all of that and other things retirement-related is our next guest.
Karen Friedman is the Executive Vice President and Policy Director of the Pension Rights Centers. She develops solutions and implements strategies to protect and promote the rights of consumers, and for more than 20 years has represented their interests in the media and before congressional committees. Ms. Friedman is also responsible for the center's day-to-day operations. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Karen Friedman.
Yeah, hi. It's great to be there.
Welcome, Karen. One of the reasons we invited you is because the pension issue not only affects tens of millions of people as we speak, but it involves trillions of dollars, which are often invested in the New York Stock Exchange corporations and could make quite a bit of influence if they exercise the voting power of these pension funds. But before we get into that, we've been hearing another round of warnings about Social Security. And could you lay out simply what the projection is for Social Security in the context of one simple question? Elderly people saying, am I going to get my Social Security as I have been getting it? And younger people saying, am I ever going to get Social Security?
Yeah, well, Ralph, let me just say this. Yes, people are going to get their Social Security. Social Security is the most successful social insurance program in this country. It's the foundation of income that 1 out of 5 older Americans rely on completely in retirement, and it's what's kept millions and millions of older Americans out of poverty. So after reading some of the, reports, the articles that have come out, I actually talked to Nancy Altman, who is one of the Social Security experts in the country. She's the president of Social Security Works, happens to be our chairman of the board. And she said, and this is just what I really want to get out to your listeners today, the trustees report has been misinterpreted. It's, as always, this is the spin that ideologues who've wanted to destroy the program since, for the last 3-4 decades have been putting out that, Social Security is going broke. Young people won't be able to. Let me tell you something. It will be around. According to the report, Social Security has an accumulated surplus of $2.9 trillion. It shows that at the end of the century in 2095, the program will cost only 6.7% of the GDP, which is lower than what's now spent in Germany, France, and other industrialized countries on their Social Security programs. But most importantly, instead of looking at the negative, let's look at the positive. The positive is Social Security is 100% funded for the next 16 years, 93% funded for the next 25 years, 87% funded over the next 50 years. And so, Ralph, if any corporation in America could say, we can pay your salaries and your pensions for the next 16 years and almost all of them for the next 20, there would be champagne popping, not this hand wringing. So the truth is that Social Security is in good shape, and all we need to do is make some tweaks in the program to make sure that it's on a sound basis for the next, 50 years. And there's lots of ways of doing that. There's legislation in Congress. Congressman Larson on the House has a bill that would put Social Security on sound actuarial funding for the next 50 to 75 years and also expand it. And it's likely to be passed. And there's other bills in Congress. So I just want to say this before we get on to pensions, which are the real problem in this country. I would say that Social Security is a success story, and the problem is the private pension system on top of Social Security, which isn't doing its job, but that Social Security is going to be there, and we just need to make sure that everybody comes together to support the program. Polls show that everybody's in support.
One of the reasons Bernie Sanders goes around the country saying that Social Security should be expanded is that there's an easy way to fund this, because if you're making $1 million in income, you only pay Social Security taxes on how much?
Like $132,000. That's the
So the argument is, this is another inequity where the rich get off. The argument is just raise it higher, raise it to 300,000, 400,000, and that will, provide an expansion of benefits. So I like the way that some of the presidential candidates in the Democratic circle, not to mention the Green Party, are asking for an expansion of benefits. Now, how would that work? You mean expansion of the monthly check or other collateral benefits?
I think that there's lots of different ways of doing it, Ralph. And, I think that what they're talking about is raising benefits over time. I don't know that it's only the minimum benefits, but there's lots of different proposals for how it would be done. The Pension Rights Center spends more time on the pension, on the problems in the pension system. So we haven't been studying all the proposals on Social Security, but we do know that expanding Social Security so that it's more adequate is the way to go. And honestly, Ralph, if we could have an expanded Social Security program that paid adequate benefits, then that could replace the private pension system in this country.
If I may interject before we get off the topic of Social Security, and this is a question to both of you, what is the motive of people who are denigrating it and trying to disparage the prospects of Social Security and ultimately destroy it? Who are these people and what do they get out of that?
Well, let me go first, and then, Ralph, you can jump on whatever I say. But, there's been ideologues that are just against government programs, right? And, some have suggested that in passing this huge tax bill, that one of the reasons for doing so was that the ideologues wanted to create this huge deficit, which would then give them the fodder to say, oh, look, we have to pay for this, and we need to cut Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. So some people are doing it simply because they ideologically do not support government programs and believe that the money would be better invested in the private market. And you remember the whole debate on privatization. They think, let's privatize the system. What I also want to say, which I didn't say before, is that Social Security is not just a program that provides retirees with benefits. It's a social insurance program that provides benefits to people who are disabled and to kids who have lost a parent, the working parent, ensuring that families, it's really a family protection plan, and there's no way that any private account could ever replace this program.
The other motive is Wall Street, that the Wall Streeters, they're looking on these trillions of dollars, say, wouldn't that be wonderful if they were invested in the stock market? And they come up with all kinds of hoked up figures that the stock market return is higher than the Social Security return. Of course, they don't pay attention to the collapse of the stock market and the psychological dread. Social Security is named Social Security, not social insecurity. If you got your money in the stock market, you're looking at it every day, up, down, different stocks. That impairs, so we say, a certain quality of life. So there's a stock market incentive to try to get large portions of the Social Security Trust Fund invested in stocks, and that increases, of course, the fees of the brokers and the whole complex up there. It was drooling under the Bush brothers, George Herbert Walker Bush and George W. Bush. But fortunately, it's one of the things the Democrats did do, and they did beat it back.
Yeah, I can imagine if it was to the 2008 crash, if they had succeeded in that. Yeah.
Imagine.
And from what I understand, that almost every poll shows that the real majority in this country completely support Social Security, are against privatization. And I think that goes with both Republicans and Democrats. People recognize that this is one of the most important programs. And just look at, our own parents or grandparents. I mean, if they didn't have Social Security, they'd be out in the streets. So this is from our perspective, you can't have a pension system. You can't have a retirement system without Social Security as the foundation.
And of course, if you want to see what it's like to put pension money in the stock market, just look at what the stock market collapse and the Wall Street crooks did to private pensions in 2008 and 2009. Let's talk about the situation in private pensions. Just illuminate this. We're talking to Karen Friedman of the Pension Rights Center. Illuminate this in terms of what is happening to the monthly check, the defined benefit plans that were the norm, and now the vast expansion and dominance of the 401k. And what's the take of the Pension Rights Center here? There is a crisis here in the pension world for sure.
Yeah, well, let me do the whole big picture for you. Only about 50% of the private workforce has pensions or retirement savings to supplement Social Security. Companies, and we've seen this over the last 10 to 20 years, but it's happening at a quicker basis now. Companies are dropping good old-fashioned defined benefit plans, and those are the guaranteed lifetime pensions and the pension plans of yore that provide guaranteed income for life to millions of people. And let me just say this, that there still are millions of people in these plans, right? So that something like 1/3 are in pension plans. And there's still a lot of public pension plans, right, that provide good old-fashioned lifetime benefits. But everything is under attack right now. So we have to do what we can to preserve those plans and preserve those benefits. But as you know, Ralph, as companies have dropped their defined benefit plans for 401k plans, which was a lower cost options for companies, it's a boon for financial institutions that have made so much money off of fees off of these 401k plans. But 401k plans have been kind of a failed experiment. Half of all workers have about $59,000 accumulated in their accounts, and those who are closest to retirement age, there's about $103,000. But a study by the National Institute of Retirement Security shows that the average working household has virtually no retirement savings other than Social Security. And if you look at all households, not just those with retirement accounts, the median account, half of all people have balances of about $2,500 for all working age households. So what we're dealing with is a huge retirement income crisis in this country. And what we need to do is we need to, from the Pension Rights Center's perspective, we have sort of two big policy goals. The first is to protect the people that are in plans and make sure that they get those benefits. And the second is we need to start looking at creating a new secure pension system that's universal, secure, and adequate for the whole country on top of Social Security, taking into account that people have good plans. Those plans should be maintained, but we need a better system. And we'd like to see the whole issue of retirement security, not just Social Security, but the issue of adequacy and security and pensions become a big part of the presidential campaign, because we think that this is a huge issue. And as more and more people are in low-paid jobs or jobs where they're now in the gig economy, pension security, even 401ks are becoming less secure. So we need to rethink retirement in a big way.
And here's something that a lot of people don't know, that the corporations control these pension plans. Even in corporations that have labor unions, they control these pension plans, and they've looted them. You remember that Wall Street Journal reporter? She wrote a great book on the pension heist. How do they loot it? By the way, the bosses have their own preferred pension plans, like there's a double standard. They have really gold-plated pension plans that are accorded to the few at the top of these large corporations. But
well, in the olden days, when there were surplus assets, there were companies way back when, we're talking about the 1980s here, and then we were able to help change the law so this wouldn't happen anymore. But there were actually companies way back when that actually were able to kind of take advantage of a loophole in the law to use those surplus assets, and they were often corporate raiders who used, the pension money in the old days to try to take over companies. And then in the 1990s, when we were able to stop that practice, but then lots of companies were able to, sort of like show their pension income on the bottom line. And when things were good, it was a way of sort of inflating their profits. And, there's all kinds of schemes that companies do to try to take advantage of their pension assets in these ways. And we're always, sort of playing catch up. But we've been able to stop a lot of those abuses. One big issue I do want to talk about, though, and it's not necessarily corporations who are doing this, but it's a real huge scandal right now. So the private pension law, Erisa, basically, protects retirees above all else. And they say that if companies want to change their benefits for the future, that's fine, but you can't cut back the already earned benefits of retirees. And back in 2014, Congress, in their great wisdom, passed a law called the Multi-Employer Pension Reform Act of 2014. And this law allowed for the very first time for trustees of these multi-employer plans, and those are plans that are negotiated by a union with more than one employer, to cut retirees' benefits as a way of balancing the books of these pension plans. And what happened was, much because of what you were talking about before, the big market meltdown in 2008, you see all these multi-employer plans that now are, over the next 10 to 20 years, running out of money. So Congress passed this law to allow plans way before they were going to go down to cut the benefits of workers and retirees. So that's been one of our huge issues, is stopping this practice. So we have seen just recently under the new administration, there's been more and more applications for benefit cuts to be approved, and we've seen thousands of retirees get their benefits cut by as much as 70%. So this is an outrageous precedent, and we're trying to change this. And Congressman Neal just introduced a bill called the Butch Lewis Act that would come up with a way of stopping this practice.
We've been talking with Karen Friedman of the Pension Rights Center. It's been around in Washington. It's helped a lot of workers and their personal pension plan grievances, as well as the big policy questions and the big proposal to have a uniform retirement system in the United States. David and Steve, any comments or questions before we conclude?
Well, I asked my question about Social Security. David, you got anything?
I'm just thinking about Hank Paulson, who just did an interview and said that people need to be educated about their pensions. Otherwise, they're going to be taken advantage of. He was the Secretary of the Treasury under George W. Bush when the economy collapsed.
And before that, chairman of Goldman Sachs.
Yes. And he said, people need to be educated. It's the responsibility of the consumer to be educated so they don't get taken advantage of.
What does that mean, Karen?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I would argue that yes, consumers need to know their rights. And the question is, what is it? I think he's probably talking about, although I'm not positive, he may be talking about just understanding what your rights are under plans. It could also mean in 401k plans. As you know, in 401k plans, one of the big problems with 401k plans is you kind of have to have money to put in. So maybe he's just talking about that you need to know what the plan says, and then you have to contribute to your 401k plan. You have to invest the money. You have to see if the employer is going to be putting in a match for you. You have to ensure that you're able to somehow make that money last. So where I would say, I don't know what he's talking about, but I would certainly say, if you're going to financial advisors, you have to make sure that that financial advisor has your best interests in mind and that they're a fiduciary, and checking on fees. I mean, that a lot of financial institutions pay these whopping fees, so you have to know how much money you're paying in fees when you have IRAs or 401k plans, and you make sure that you know that the plan that you have, is keeping the fees as low as it can be. But I don't exactly know what he's talking about.
Well, I know the outrage that I felt was, well, if you're the Secretary of the Treasury, shouldn't you be the one protecting us?
Yeah, well, that is the thing. I mean, I actually think it should be, yes. The truth is that we've moved from, and this is Ralph's first point, we've moved from a system of defined benefit plans, or these pension plans, where the money was put in for you, it was invested by the plan, pooled and professionally invested, and you had lifetime income. And we moved in the 401k world to a do-it-yourself system where suddenly individuals had to manage their own retirement. And, individuals, I mean, even people that are, PhD economists have not done a great job managing their 401ks. It's just not what people can do. And so, yeah, there's a lot of obstacles in terms of companies offer 401ks, and then you have to decide again, as I was saying before, you have to decide how much money to put in, where to invest the money, whether the employer's putting in money, how to make that money last for your lifetime. And if you're in an IRA or something like that, I mean, a lot of people don't have 401ks, don't have pension plans. Some people are saying, oh, yeah, you should invest the money yourself. I mean, how can people do this? We're living in a time, it's the Uber economy, it's the Lyft economy. People are trying to just put food on their table. How are they supposed to be able to also save for retirement?
Yeah. If Henry Paulson was candid, he would have said, David, it's a shark tank of investor firms. Educate yourself. Yeah, in a shark tank.
Right, exactly. And that shouldn't be what we have. We shouldn't be putting people into shark tanks. And we should have a system that works, that's, is universal, adequate, where employers and employees can put in money, where the money's pooled and professionally invested, where there's, you're going to end up with money that's adequate and that you can live on for the rest of your life. And that's what we're pushing toward, is a new system that makes sense for everybody. And, Social Security does do all that, right? So we want to preserve Social Security, we want to strengthen Social Security, but we want a retirement system that's rational and makes sense for individuals.
Karen, tell people how they can contact the Pension Rights Center before we conclude.
Okay, so if you want to reach the Pension Rights Center, and also I do want to say that we also help people with their pension problems. So if people have issues around their pensions, please give us a call and we can help you with that, and also talk about legislative issues and public policy. You can call us at 202-296-3776, and our website is www.pensionrights.org.
Repeat that phone number once again, slowly.
202-296-3776.
Thank you very much, Karen Friedman.
Okay, thank you very much. Talk to you soon.
We have been speaking with Karen Friedman of the Pension Rights Center. We will link to that at RalphNaderRadioHour.com. I want to thank our guests again, Drs. Rania Milleron and Nicholas Sakellariou, as well as Karen Friedman. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. A transcript of the show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
For Ralph Nader's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
And Ralph has got 2 new books out, The Fable, How the Rats Reformed the Congress. To acquire a copy of that, go to ratsreformcongress.org. And To the Ramparts, How Bush and Obama Paved the Way for the Trump Presidency, and Why It Isn't Too Late to Reverse Course. We will link to that also.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. Listeners should get ready for the emerging constitutional crisis between Trump and the Trumpsters and the U.S. Congress and the federal courts. It's coming big. Trump wants to crush the rule of law and crush his constitutional accountability. We'll have more on that in future programs.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the Wrap-Up. In this first section, we continue our discussion of ethics, politics, and whistleblowing in engineering.
What this book does, I don't know, the way people hear the word engineering, they think, oh, it's beyond me, it's very technical, and but if you look at some of the chapter titles, just look how intriguing they are. You've got Discipline and Play, The Art of Engineering by the great Princeton engineering professor David Billington, who taught Princeton engineers engineering history. So when they went over the great dams that were built in the West, they were given the whole historical context. And then there's another chapter that says, Engineer on a Mission, a Jesuit priest finds a new calling in Africa. Or another one called Heroes or Civils, Gender and Engineering Ethics. Then there's one by Rania called Can Real Women Be Imaginary Engineers? And Nicholas has a chapter on a anthropological perspective to engineering. And then, there are chapters on nuclear power, chapters on knowing how to blow the whistle. That's a technique. You got to know how to go step by step, protect yourself. And they go into the engineering societies. When you have engineering students, they don't even study their engineering society they're going to be a member of, like the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, Society of Automotive Engineers. But these societies, which are dominated by corporations, like the auto industry dominates the Society of Automotive Engineers, they set standards which often lawmakers at the state and federal level just appropriate into federal law. Now, if those standards are low common denominator standards, that's not protecting the public. So this book raises the ethical issues for these engineering societies. If they represent a profession, they should strive to be independent of the corporations. Like the chemical companies control the American Chemical Society, or the pipeline companies have a lot of influence over the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. And one chapter intrigued me was Disasters as Object Lessons in Ethics, a case study of Hurricane Katrina. And another chapter says, The Engineer as a Local, Not Global Citizen.
Anything you guys would like to say? Because we have a little bonus wrap-up section based on what Ralph said.
The book refers to case studies, but I think it goes beyond learning from the case study in the chapter that Will pointed out that was about Hurricane Katrina gives an example of how you don't necessarily need to read about every case study. I think that's what should be done in classrooms around the United States. But you can learn fundamental principles, for example, about ethics and engineering from Hurricane Katrina that couldn't be applied to other situations. And so I think that the book is not outdated by talking about a list of case studies that happened a long time ago. I think it has some classic cases that can be applied today in the future. Ethics issues are not necessarily resolved. Every generation of engineers needs to think about these issues on their own. And so these issues, they're always going to be around.
I just want to pick up on the Hurricane Katrina because I actually have a question about that. As we all know, it devastated the city of New Orleans in 2005. And there are obviously a lot of social and political issues connected to that disaster having to do with the race, poverty, and class. But there's also an engineering problem having to do with the levees. And obviously a levee can't prevent a hurricane. What could have, is my question, should have been done to those levees to mitigate the disaster? Could ethical engineering have prevented that disaster? And on a planet that's prone to natural disasters, how do humans ethically build things that can withstand an act of God?
Hurricane Katrina is very complex. If you read the article in our book about the chapter in our book about that, it's multifactorial. The levees were not the only reason that we had this super disaster and, over 1,800 people died, but the levees were part of it. And there were politics and ethical issues, and there probably needed to have been whistleblowers that stepped forward to correct those issues. And it didn't happen. And so in the future, we can learn from that.
One final thought about professionalism, since Rolf mentioned this, it seems to me that the book, one of the main goals of the book is to make young engineers rethink the very notion of professionalism along the lines of public service, social justice, and what it really means to do engineering work. For whom, right? Who are our clients? Who's going to be using these products? For what reason? Who's going to be affected? So we're trying to broaden this idea of professionalism to include tough questions about culture, about society, about politics. And it's very important because professionalism is resisted by corporations. Even the very structures that enforce professionalism, the licenses, do not make much sense for my students, for example, because they are computer experts, and in order to get a license, they have to go through very cumbersome exams on, say, thermodynamics. So it seems to me that, for example, the license has to be reconsidered, has to be redesigned, and both engineers, people from professional societies have to take part in that conversation of rethinking professionalism. It's very, very important. We have to bring meaning back to professionalism in engineering. It's very important.
Next, Ralph has an extended conversation with Karen Friedman of the Pension Rights Center.
Karen, I just came across a report by MarketWatch that talked about big companies buying back their stock, tens of billions of dollars, while their pension plan is underfunded. And Boeing, General Electric, they are among those. Boeing bought back $30 billion of their stock between 2009 and 2017, and their pension plan for their workers is underfunded. Is there any federal protection of that, or what can be done about that?
Well, that's pretty outrageous, Ralph. It's something that we should look at together. Yeah, that's a pretty outrageous thing. And also, because Boeing gets all this government money, and we know all the horrors of Boeing right now, but, they get all this government money. They should be having the best practices, not the worst. But I don't know that much about their pension plan, but we certainly can look at that together.
The great federal pension law called Erisa, which Karen Ferguson worked on when she started with the Pension Rights Center, which I helped start, that doesn't have any protection for that. Because when you got these stock buybacks, they basically improve the metrics for the executive compensation of the bosses at the top. And ostensibly, they increase the value of the shares, although that's very temporary often and very debatable. But is there anybody proposing, is the Afl-Cio or anybody proposing that the pension plan has to be funded first, not underfunded and drained away into stock buybacks?
Well, to my knowledge, I don't know of anybody proposing that, but it's an interesting idea to certainly talk about. I mean, there's obviously funding rules in Erisa that require that companies fund their plans, but in terms of the relationship between that and the stock buyback, I'll have to look into that, Ralph.
Karen, I'm urging people during the presidential campaign, when they meet these candidates in New Hampshire and Iowa and all over the country, and there's 19 of them already, Democratic camp, what's your policy on pensions? What's your policy on private pensions? What's your policy on Social Security? So you can nail them down specifically. Do you think the Afl-Cio should survey all the presidential candidates from all the parties on pension issues and Social Security issues so they can nail down where they stand on this and improve the political conversation in the coming presidential campaign months?
Absolutely. I think that the union should be doing this, and I assume the ARP and others will be doing this. But absolutely, we need to nail down where the candidates are. We need to make this into a big issue for the country because the retirement insecurity is only getting worse. And, something else I wanted to say earlier, which is that polls show that people are more worried about not having enough money for retirement than any other economic issue, including paying for health care, their mortgage, kids' education. And so, part of the reason is because, as I said earlier, so few people are participating in plans, or if they are, they're just not accumulating enough money for retirement. So people are very scared. They're concerned. So this should be a huge issue in the presidential election.
And it comes down again, listeners, as you've heard me say 1,000 times, Congress, 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 Congress. Get control of Congress, 535 people, that's all. Probably 150 of them agree with what Karen is saying. Get control of Congress, and all these things can be turned around.
Karen Friedman wanted to elaborate on a few more things after our main interview, so she called us back later and spoke to Steve.
So there's one issue we've been working on, which is outrageous, but it will sound kind of technical because it's about a notice put out by the Treasury Department that can actually change whether people have protections or they don't have protections. The issue is called, in the lingo, de-risking. But what it really means is that every day companies are trying to get out of pension plans to, sort of cut back protections for workers and retirees and essentially save money. So the new thing in de-risking, it basically means the companies are selling their liabilities to insurance companies, which means that individuals will get their pensions instead of from the pension plan. These retirees will get them from the insurance company, which in most cases, retirees are going to be fully protected. But what retirees need to know in these transactions is that they're no longer covered by the federal private pension law, Erisa. But the more troubling thing to us is not just these sales of the liabilities to insurance companies, but this new practice that's occurred over the last 5 or 6 years called lump sum buyouts. And basically in these situations, companies, and we saw it with GM, Verizon, and others, they were offering lump sum buyouts to retirees already in pay status, which has never happened before. What does that mean? It means that I'm a retiree. I could be 75. I could be 85. I could have my spouse next to me. And suddenly the company says, hey, you're getting this pension of, $500 or $600 a month. But guess what? We can give you a lump sum worth $300,000 right now if you accept that instead of the pension. So retirees, at that point, who knows? Are they cognitively impaired? Are they economists? Are they able to do the math on this? So, they're being tantalized by this huge lump of money. And they're being told, some folks are going to take it because they're going to say, well, I'd rather have this big lump of money than get a pension. Like, who knows what's going to happen in the future? But what it really does is it means that the company, because of all kinds of economic factors, interest rate assumptions, loss of legal protections, et cetera, will end up getting a pension in a lot of cases that is worth 20 to 30% less than they would have gotten. So in other words, companies are not offering these lump sums to retirees because, we're so generous. Aren't we so great? No, they're doing it to save money. And what does it mean for retirees? It means that retirees, if they take that lump of money, they are going to have to invest it themselves, right? And they're going to have to invest it in the stock market. And economists say rarely, if ever, will they be able to replicate the security of a pension. And then also, if you go to an investment advisor or to a mutual fund, they're going to have to pay high fees to have somebody else invest that money. And there's no way they're going to make up the difference and they're not going to be able to get the same security of that original pension. So in essence, you're kind of turning what was a secure pension into an insecure, lump of money of a 401k. So we think it's really outrageous to be putting retirees in that position. And also, what a lot of retirees won't understand is that they'll lose the spousal protection. So if they're, in many situations, especially now, if people have pensions, so I'm going to say he, she, but obviously that changes. But, if the retiree has a spouse and they die, then, the spouse will lose that automatic spousal protection that now is in pension plans. So we've made this into a huge issue. And this is the key point on this is that the Treasury Department under the Obama administration stopped these lump sums by issuing a notice back in 2015. And just a few weeks ago, the Secretary of the Treasury, Mnuchin, reversed that decision. So basically, why would the Treasury Department do it? Well, most likely because they were lobbied by companies to do it. And they reversed the decision that made sense. And, they're putting potentially retirees' security at risk. So there's all kinds of things that are happening like that. And sometimes it's done in this situation, kind of behind the scenes, through the regulatory process. It sounds very technical, so a lot of people don't pay attention. But meanwhile, it's eroding the retirement security of workers and retirees. So those are the kinds of issues that the Pension Rights Center steps in on. We're always trying to protect consumers. We get involved not just in the legislative process, but we also get involved in the regulatory process to make sure that consumers' interests are at the forefront of the agency head so they know that we're here to protect consumers. And, Ralph started the Pension Rights Center way back when in 1976. So we are one of the original public interest organizations that's been doing this work for now 43 years. And that's all good. Another point that I really want to make is that retirement security is not a partisan issue. It really isn't. Pensions are the most sort of American, apple pie, American values issue. You're talking about people who gave up wages, either explicitly when they are in a union through the negotiation process or implicitly to have a pension when they retire. So that what a lot of people don't understand are that pensions are deferred wages and they're earned by people. So in a situation where we're seeing like in multi-employer plans that are underfunded, where retirees' benefits are being cut because Congress has allowed this to happen, you're basically cutting the benefits that people earn, that they relied on, that they can't get back. And that to us is fundamentally unfair. So we believe the pension promises must be kept. And if the system isn't working, what we need to do is try to keep the plans that work and keep the best parts of plans, but we should be working on a new system that makes sense for the country on top of Social Security, one that's universal, secure, and adequate, where employers and employees put in money, the money's pulled and professionally invested, and people get that money as a stream of benefits when they retire. This whole do-it-yourself savings craze that has been in place just doesn't work. And it's not fair to ask people who have jobs that are struggling to put food on the table that they also somehow have to manage their retirement. And the reason that the pension system is so heavily tax subsidized to the tune of billions of dollars is because Congress recognized long ago that to get people to save, you need to have an incentive. So both, when companies have a pension plan, they'll get the money put in is on a benefits the company through tax deferrals, and when employees put in money in 401k plans, that money also is tax subsidized. And the reason we have such a heavily tax subsidized system, as I said, is because there's a recognition of how hard it is to save for retirement. Unfortunately, a lot of the tax breaks are misdirected, and they go to help the wealthiest people save for retirement. And what we feel is that there has to be a redirection of those tax subsidies toward a system that's fair for all people.
That's interesting. We're always on this show making the comparison between street crime and corporate crime, and how the corporate crime is so many hundreds of millions and billions of dollars worse than street crime, even though street crime gets more press because it's more dramatic. And this seems like, people have been trying to con old people out of their retirement and their money for years. And so you have your grifter, but then this also seems very, another, this thing you were talking about, de-risking and giving this lump sum, seems like another very sophisticated white collar way to screw old people out of their money.
Yeah. I mean, in this situation, de-risking, people will get, especially if they end up with an annuity from an insurance company, they will get the benefits that they were promised. Some of the issues that we had when this issue first started, we were asking, what happens if the insurance company goes over? What are the protections? There's all kinds of issues that do come up in this, but for the most part, at least up until now, they've been huge insurance companies that are doing this. But yeah, with the lump sums, there's a lot of stuff going out, on where, companies they just really don't want to be providing pensions anymore. And, often as,
they're trying to unburden themselves.
Yeah, they're trying to unburden themselves. They no longer want to be part of it. But, as Ellen Schultz, who used to be a journalist with the Wall Street Journal, but she documented in a book that she wrote, not, probably a few years ago, but the ways in which pensions can be sort of corporate profit centers. And the lump sum issue in its own way is another example of pension plans becoming sort of a corporate profit center where, the company sort of saves money in doing this. And there was a situation recently where MetLife was sued because and it was sort of in this de-risking situation, but where they weren't able to find participants, and they ended up sitting on millions of dollars of sort of lost pension benefits that actually belonged to workers and retirees that were never paid out. And that's actually more common than one would think. So the Labor Department has done a study showing that lots and lots of benefits never get paid because, the company is unable, I put that in air quotes, unable to find people. They haven't really gone, as far as we're concerned, they haven't made the necessary effort to find the people. And so the money goes back to the plans. So,
right.
That also is a really unfair issue that we're starting to look at, which is the issue of lost pensions. So, there's the sort of the big issues, and that's sort of like, how do we provide retirement security to all of these baby boomers and then the next generations. And we're very concerned at the Pension Rights Center. Right now we are really trying to protect people in the system, but, we look ahead, and with each generation, the idea of retirement security just becomes a little bit more insecure, right? I mean, you had kind of the baby boomers and the generation before that might have had good pension plans. There's still a lot of government workers that have pension plans, and there's an attack ideological throughout the country trying to say, why should public sector workers have good pension plans if private sector workers don't have these? We always think that that's just a backwards question. It should be, why shouldn't we all have good pensions just like
right.
those in the public sector, and still millions of people in the private sector, typically in the unionized sector, but also in big companies. But there's been kind of I think we're entering into a time where nobody can rely on anything, and that there's, as I said, there's workers and retirees give up wages for pensions. a pension is really just the flip side of wages. You should be able to give up wages today so that tomorrow you can have a good pension, and everybody benefits from that, right? Pensions,
Right.
I like to say that pensions cascade through generations, that if you have a pension, then you're better not just helping your spouse, but you're better able to help perhaps other people in your family, whether it's your
And other people
children
in your
or
family don't have to help you.
Exactly. And it helps communities and it helps the economy, right? You have a pension, you're still going to go out on weekends and maybe go get a hamburger, go to a movie theater. When that money disappears, that also disappears out of the economy. So it's very short-sighted to say, oh, let's just get rid of pensions. And we're just pitting everybody against each other. And this is a whole other topic, which I'm sure you've dealt with a lot, and this is kind of my personal pet peeve, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is just the whole issue of going into this, the new robot gig economy where, young people are all into this entrepreneurial work. Isn't this great? We're going to be the next millionaire. But meanwhile, there's not an employer. You're not really getting wages. There's no employment relationship between you and this, like in the Uber economy. You're not going to have a pension. Maybe you'll have an IRA, which, people are barely saving in them. I mean, we're going to have a very insecure generation. And as we get to be more of an artificial intelligence society and more jobs disappear, what happens to retirement? So those are kind of the big issues that need to be contemplated. And that's why Social Security is so important. And young and old have to support Social Security. And then we need a pension system that makes sense on top of Social Security. And
Right.
That's where, we'll work with Ralph and others to work toward that.
Well, very good. Is there anything else?
I don't think so, but I think, I think I'm more on a roll now than I was when I talked to you about a talk. So, it's like one of those things that afterwards I was like, like the Paulson thing when I was sort of like, wait a minute, that's kind of,
yeah.
I could say that again if you ask the question, which is the idea that the fact that he is telling people that they should beware and educate themselves because something could go wrong. I mean, we should have a system in place where, of course, consumers need to be educated about things, but they shouldn't have to be worrying about protecting themselves against, against high fees and charlatans, who are financial advisors and, people that are not working in their self-interest. So we have the wrong system if that's the way we're going.
Well, yeah, and it's a whole psychology that's probably, Hank Paulson, it doesn't occur to him that not everybody has the insight or the wherewithal, the experience to be able to even ask the right questions. And I think about when Rex Tillerson was the head of ExxonMobil and he was being considered for Secretary of State. And there was a video of him when they asked him about climate change. And of course, he believed in climate change. And what do we do? And he said, well, we'll do, what humans always do. We'll adapt. Well, yeah, that's a pretty easy thing for you to say on your rung of the economic ladder.
Right.
But, there are people other places who it's going to be a lot harder. Or people would say after Hurricane Katrina, well, they should just move out of New Orleans. Well, yeah, that's easy for you to say because you have the wherewithal to move. But there's this whole psychology of people living in a bubble who aren't really in touch with how simple things for them are difficult for others.
Yeah, and the people in the bubbles often have in the past, especially, were making the policies, right? And like I was at a conference recently, and people were talking about the big problem is a term which makes me laugh, but they call it leakage, where, people take money out of retirement accounts. And one person happened to say, yeah, well, I have 5 retirement accounts and it's so hard to keep track of it. And then a woman who was representing lower income people said, well, that's true and that's an issue, but it's also a great problem to have.
Yeah.
What about all the people who have nothing or they only have a little bit saved? The real issue is that people don't have enough to save, and we shouldn't be putting all the risks, all the responsibilities onto individuals who not, even if they did have the skills, I mean, people have other things to do. They have to make a living. They have to take care of families. They have to take care of, getting food on the table. There's other things people should be doing. People shouldn't have to be figuring out, how to make it in retirement. And
right. Or how to invest the money. I'm going to go to the casino and I'm going to, because I'm very good at blackjack,
Right,
You're not so good at
exactly.
blackjack. The house usually wins.
No, it's true. And, I'm now dealing, I'm just going to say this because this is my own personal story, but I am now dealing with my parents who are 91 and 95 and live in Connecticut. And I travel up from Washington to Connecticut every 2 weeks. And, I've been managed to get my dad onto Title 19 of Medicaid and figuring out, all the stuff to do. And in the amount of time, it's almost like a second job, right? To figure out how to manage this and how to make sure that they get aids. And they did run out of their retirement money except for Social Security, and God bless Social Security for having it. But every time I go up there, I think, what would people do who don't have the skills that I have in terms of, I'm an advocate. That's what I do for a living, right? So I'm able to figure stuff out, and I know who to talk to, and I can get this. But every family individually has to deal with long-term care issues. They have to deal with, how to manage our retirement money. And more people are trying to figure out, how do I have 5 different jobs at the same time for non-employers? I mean, we are putting so much on individuals, and people are looking at that as progress. Is it? We have to have structures in place, and a lot of the problems that people take personally, I haven't saved enough money, are not their problems. They're structural problems that we need to have systems that work. And that's why Social Security is so beautiful, right? Because it is a defined benefit plan. People do get guaranteed benefits. People work and they earn that money. The money is invested. They get their Social Security checks. Well, in the old days, and for the extent to which they have them, defined benefit plans, money went in, pooled and professionally invested, people did their work, they retired, got a pension for life. Now, companies are trying to, undercut that in every place. Employers don't want to be in that position anymore of offering pensions. Okay, then if they don't, then we've got to come up with a system where employers can pay in. And when I use the word employer, I'm even talking about, those that don't look at themselves as employers. And the employees put in, but we still have whatever it is, whether it's a government program or it could be you could have independent. In Australia, they have, pension plans were different, based on different jobs. They have lots of different pension plans. They have sort of competitive institutions that invest the money. But in Australia, it's mandatory. And I don't have the percentages exactly right, but it's sort of like, 12% that employers put in and X percent that employees put in. Well, we need something like that. And that we need to come up with new ideas. And that's where we're really going to start putting our time soon.
Well, very good. Very good. Well, thanks for giving us all that extra.
Okay, good. Well, thanks for letting me.
And that's a wrap. Join us again next week. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting way